Hello and welcome back to Badasses of History. Just a reminder, this podcast is now available on every major platform. So that's Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever you get them, I'm on it now. So you don't have to just keep tuning into Spreaker in order to hear it. Today's episode is about a guy from World War I who obviously survived some pretty crazy stuff. Enjoy! On December 13th, 1917, a badass was born. His name was Jan Baalsrud, which is too close to Dan to not say it, so from now on we're going to call him Dan. Dan grew up in Norway, and in 1939 he graduated with a degree in instrument making, which apparently was a thing. He didn't get to use his skill set very much because 1 year later in 1940, Germany invaded Norway. Dan fought during the invasion, but was eventually forced to run to Sweden. There, he was convicted of espionage and exiled. Over the next year, young Danny would have a hard time finding his place in life. He traveled to Sweden, the Soviet Union, Africa, the United States, and eventually was accepted with open arms in Britain. While in Britain, Dan wasted no time joining up with their military. In 1943, while operating with a few other commandos and a handful of men, Dan began the Norwegian resistance movement. The first order of business was to go out by boat and destroy the German air control tower. Unfortunately, their land contact, whom the commandos thought they could trust, turned out to be the wrong person entirely, and they ended up telling their entire plan to a stranger, who in turn told the Germans. The Germans obviously responded by taking out their boat. Now, Danny and the boys were hauling 8 tons of explosives meant for the tower, so they really couldn't fight back, they just had to jump ship. The icy water they jumped into was the Arctic Ocean, and it was nearly frozen over. All the men attempted to swim ashore, but not all made it. Those who did were quickly captured by the Germans, but not Dan. Dan managed to evade capture and make it to a snow gully to hide out. On his way, he shot and killed a Gestapo officer and then hid in the gully. He did this all with one shoe on. Dan avoided the Germans for 2 months, but he was falling apart physically and was forced to rely on the help from the Norwegian patriots who were still resisting Hitler. They put him in a hut and attempted to warm him up, but his legs weren't doing too good. There was no doctor, so Dan was left by himself with his own judgment. He decided he had a small case of blood poisoning, and he needed to drain his legs. So, he grabbed his pocket knife and sliced up his legs until his blood was the right color. Experts aren't sure if this did anything or not. He might have just cut himself up for no reason. But regardless, he felt better about the situation. Some days later, Dan was really starting to deteriorate. The rebels saw this and decided to transport him. They bundled him up in a cocoon of coats and blankets, put him on a stretcher, and headed out. The rebels didn't get very far before they were nearly spotted by a German patrol. High up on a plateau, they set Dan down by a snow wall and basically just bailed. They were like, "Sorry, bro, but we don't want to die, and you're really heavy, so good luck." The cave he was in was really just a small crack in the side of a boulder. It was hardly a shelter. It was there that he would spend the next 27 days. He wasn't well enough to leave, but he also couldn't get better because he was left in a freaking cave. Now, the locals would sneak up the mountain every other night to bring him food and water, but there was no way of retrieving him without the risk of being caught, tortured, and executed. So they left him. Eventually, after frostbite had set in on Dan's toes, he was forced to operate to stop the spread of gangrene. This action actually did save his life. Big Dan stared down at his now blackened toes and grabbed his pocket knife. He knew if he let this go, it would spread and eventually kill him. So he did what any desperate man in a cave for 3 weeks would do. He chopped them all off. Well, all except one. I couldn't find which one he saved, but I'm really curious to which one and exactly why. Anyway, at this point, Dan didn't have much longer to live. He just cut all his freaking toes off, he weighed a mere 80 pounds, and was constantly in and out of hypothermia. The rebels eventually put the band back together and decided to finally get him out. Throughout the next few weeks, Dan would be handed off to multiple different groups and families to make his way to neutral Sweden. Once he arrived, a Red Cross seaplane picked him up and took him to a hospital to recover. It took him 7 months to finally recover, and he could somewhat walk during this time frame, but it was very slow and very labored. After he recovered, Dan was shipped off to Scotland to train Norwegian patriots to continue the combat against the Germans. Once he trained himself to walk completely independent with only one toe, he was flown back to Norway and served as an agent until the end of the war in 1945. Once Hitler was dead and his regime fell apart, Dan was able to go back home to his family he left 5 years earlier. There, he lived a quiet and peaceful life with them until his death in 1988. He was 71 years old. Alright guys, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then tell your frickin' friends about it! Thanks!